It's not the Ukrainian war. Ukraine didn't choose this war. It's not the Russia-Ukraine war, right? It's not two equal powers, right? You can call it the Russian invasion of Ukraine, maybe, or you could say it's the war for Ukrainian sovereignty. That's what the entirety of the battle is. It's not about NATO. Should Ukraine be a sovereign nation or not? I believe there is a Ukrainian nation. There is a Ukrainian language. This, as an independent nation, should make the choice of where they want to go and what their future should be. And the most important battle as an American, as somebody sitting here, how I can help to win the war is to focus on political support for Ukraine in Washington.
In episode number 7, we are joined by one of the original American expat pioneers in newly independent Ukraine, Jed Sunden. Jed started the Kyiv Post in 1995, the first English-language newspaper in Ukraine. In early 2024, Jed founded the American Ukraine PAC to lobby for political support for Ukraine to the US Congress.
So here we are talking Ukraine in English, and our guest today is Jed Sunden from New York City originally, but he is the founder of the Kyiv Post, the first and biggest English language newspaper in Ukraine. And more recently, he's the founder of the Ukraine American PAC. So I'm really excited and even honored to be meeting you today. Your name has sort of in the expat circles in Ukraine throughout the last 20 years has certainly been known. We've never quite crossed paths, but I always knew who you were. So I'm really interested to kind of dig into and find out more about your story and how you launched this and what your motivations were. So why don't we start, like, when did you first go to Ukraine and why?
Okay, great. Thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to chat. And it's always great to have an opportunity to talk more about Ukraine and try and, introduce Ukraine to a wider audience. So I first went to Ukraine after I graduated college, right? I didn't grow up in a Ukrainian household, and we didn't really have family ties to Ukraine. Now, I was in college, in 88 to 92, when the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest story in the world, right? And it was sort of an unthinkable thing. Obviously, now we understand and almost feels inevitable. At the time, it was unthinkable, to most people. And, I had studied Soviet history and then went over to Kyiv on a research project. And from there, set up the business. And it's funny now in hindsight, funny in not in a funny haha, but funny in an ironic and sad way. In college, I had studied Soviet history, and was deeply involved in the study of it. The idea of studying Ukraine as a separate country with a separate history was basically unknown in the Soviet history area. It was a monolithic Soviet history, and the component parts were unknown. And to think, hey, there's this country and it's separate and it has its own unique history wasn't part of the education. So on my arrival to Ukraine, basically everything I thought I knew, I realized was completely wrong. One, the nationality question, which I just mentioned, and that's writ large across, the territory and the independent countries. In the 80s, there were basically two thoughts on Soviet history, and, there was still this idea of the third way. There was communism, capitalism, and when communism will end, it won't, morph into capitalism. There will be some third way, which takes the best of both worlds. That was still a common idea. Now, upon arrival in Kiev and seeing the catastrophe of communism, writ large in the poverty and etc., you could understand that all those ideas were completely wrong, and everything I'd studied in college was detached from reality.
Hmm. It was more like a, I guess, glorified, you mean, or it was sort of like this fantastical, like romanticized version of.
A little bit, and again, this is hard to think now, so many years later. Back then, the Soviet history faculty were the most politicized in the university. So most of the time, when people were speaking about in the West, I'm saying, when they were speaking about the Soviet Union, they weren't talking about the Soviet Union. They were speaking about their views on America. So,
Mhm.
oh, there's a third way. Well, that's what we want America to move towards,
Right.
et
Right.
cetera, et cetera. The closest you can, and this isn't a exact comparison, but there's some similarity. I think today you realize when a lot of people are speaking about Israel Palestine, right, and their views on Gaza, they're not talking about what's in Gaza because, again, they don't have a lot of firsthand experience in Gaza. They're talking about their views about America or Europe.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously you also understand that the Middle East faculty today in universities are highly politicized, not over historical questions, but over modern political questions.
Yeah. So you get to Ukraine. It's different than what you expected. Why did you decide to stay?
Some of it was, hey, I was post college and looking for an adventure, and there was a lot of adventure to be had there. And I stumbled on and set up the Kyiv Post, which it played a key role of connecting. And again, Ukraine was very isolated under the Soviets, and it played a key role in connecting the foreign community that was just entering Ukraine and Ukrainians, and it was an important platform in that way, in terms of transmitting news and information both ways to allow foreigners to get a window of what was going on in Ukraine, and to an extent for Ukrainians to understand foreigners better. Um, Now, there were two key issues in the 90s in Ukraine, which both ways. And again, this is a pre-internet era, which again, is a little tough to see.
Yeah.
But
Let's throw out a year. This is like 93, 94.
95, we set it up. So, yeah, it was 1995, right before my 25th birthday. Um, Ukraine had two big problems. They were coming out of the post-Soviet era. There was a very poor country due to communism, right? The economy, there was hyperinflation. Um, and Ukraine under Kuchma in the 90s, the situation for free press was absolutely terrible, right? There was a lot of, starting in the early 90s and going towards 2000, it's peaked at the murder of Gangadze in 2000, right? The situation for free press was very difficult. And, much worse. It was a very, very difficult situation. So, we were very lucky, and I said we, me, meaning the newspaper and the company, that there were a couple of very high quality journalists, Americans, who had, gone through the American newspaper tradition, had worked in American newspapers, who were, interested in the story of Ukraine, and were, put in tremendous work in a very difficult environment with very little pay to build the Kyiv Post. Our first editor, Igor Greenwald, had worked in newspapers in Massachusetts and really set a tradition of high journalistic standards, from the get-go, which was followed by the subsequent editors and the journalists who came up through the newspaper.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, you didn't have per se a journalism background. You had a history background, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what prompted you to be like, I'm gonna make this project. I'm gonna take this like on and create a fucking paper in this foreign country where I don't really speak the language. I mean, like, what was like, this is a good idea. Like, I'm gonna try this. Like, what?
Half idiocy and half lunacy and what have you. The only thing you could say was, hey, there were similar papers, and you could look at the model in Prague and Budapest and Moscow. Oh, right. They were tapping into something in playing that connecting role. So in that sense, it wasn't unique. You could look around and say, well, jeepers, there's a model for what they're doing, and then we were able to tune it and adapt it to what Kyiv and Ukraine needed. And again, that was our business for the first couple of years, and then from there we started basically every year adding new publications. So we started in the late '90s with the Yellow Pages. Again, it's an antiquated thing, but it was a very needed, business directory, and you're just listing telephone numbers. Then we started with women's magazines. We got into the internet in 2000, and we became the largest consumer-facing internet company. Basically for the first 15 years of the Ukrainian internet. Coming up with the portal and free email, and then news, and then from there we built the largest local language news magazine, Correspondent, and which is became an important publication, and in terms of doing reporting in Ukraine for Ukrainians.
It was sort of like Newsweek, right? Like
yeah, it started like that. So it had two sides. It had the publication Newsweek, and then we were also the #1 news portal. So we did have 24/7. In the same way that you would view CNN, and with opinion and commentary and this and that. And as I say, we were very lucky that you mentioned I didn't have a journalism background, and some of the ideals of journalism and the separation of business and editorial, and how to do reporting, and the journalistic independence, those were brought into the company by some of the early journalists and editors who were brought on, and the Americans who did a phenomenal job, and they had it, and then they transferred those values to the journalists that they were training. At one point, basically every foreign journalist working in Ukraine at Wall Street Journal, at Deutsche DW and AP, right? Those are all graduates of the Kyiv Post in one way or the other, and you can see it, even now, into other local language, publications, etc. It really was a training ground for journalists in Ukraine writ large.
You were bringing, like, I guess, a Western standard of journalism.
Yeah.
Into a former Soviet country that didn't really have any history or experience with that, right? So you guys were sort of setting the standard for, like, what is modern journalism there, right?
They didn't have that tradition, I'll tell you. So in order to, and one thing that was very lucky when we set it up, right? The tradition in the Soviet Union was, hey, you could get a registration for a newspaper very easily. You just needed a piece of paper, a dovitka, right? And basically anybody who applied, as long as the name wasn't used, it was basically automatically given. Now, the way that the Soviets controlled press wasn't in the registration, right? If you would imagine, if you wanted a radio station, the registration is very difficult because you have to get airwave permission, right? You can't just start broadcasting a radio station. You have to get the specific rights. To get a newspaper permission, like I say, was very easy. The way that the Soviets controlled it was that they had censors, and you would have to get approval for anything to be printed. They would have to sign off on it, right? So, you could get the approval, but the printer wouldn't print anything without that signature. Now, in the 90s, that was obviously broken down because the Communist Party was gone, et cetera, et cetera. So when I went to get the approval, I had to go to the Ministry of Press, and they walked me through, and they couldn't figure out what to do with me, and they couldn't figure out why not to give it to me. So they gave it to me, and the position of the censor was still there, but now it was voluntary. And so they sat me down, and this guy said, listen, anytime you want, you have any question, you can come in here and I'll, give you the signature, etc. Now, the printing plants didn't demand the signature anymore. So, the system that the Soviets had to control press was, it was gone. And so it was in the 90s sort of this very, at least, in when we started in connection to the government, a very open field, right? The old system of control was gone, and they hadn't developed a new system. As the 90s went on and Kuchma solidified his power, they began to develop different systems. And, some of it was, just on, depending on who owned the newspapers, right? So a lot of them, ended up being bought by, what were, called oligarchs who had different business interests. And right, the newspaper was sort of an advertising vehicle or a political vehicle for their other business interests, right? So you could lean on them that way. And, if you remember the Melnichenko tapes, right, where they taped Kuchma, etc., they spoke about it openly. Hey, this is what we need to do. And they spoke openly about the Kyiv Post and how they should put pressure on it, right? They said, oh, that Jed guy, he's going to live out of control. What we need to do is start sending the tax inspection, or a lot of office space was owned in one way or another by the city government. So where we were renting office space, it was owned by the city government. They said, well, why don't we just start raising his rent, triple his rent and kick him out of his office? So that's on tape, like how they wanted to do it. And then what they subsequently figured, and which became the trademark of the Kuchma years, were the filmniki. They would put out suggestions, mainly to TV stations, of how to report on certain news, and that was how they unofficially controlled the press. We always remained in this sort of area, and again, right, most of our advertising base wasn't state-owned companies, right? We didn't have any connection to that, and a lot of it were foreign companies, so that there was, the Ukrainian government couldn't pressure it, so we were a lot more free, and we're a lot more aggressive in our reporting than a lot of the other Ukrainian newspapers.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, does being like a foreigner and having foreign employees, did that give you guys a bit of a different sort of protection or a shield or layer of protection?
Because it was pretty wild. And obviously, look, you look at what happened in the 90s, and obviously Gangadze, got murdered, right? So like, let's, right, and there was violence against journalism. He wasn't the only one. He's just obviously the best known. We had some layer of protection, et cetera, et cetera. And, you could mention, there were ways they were trying to put pressure on us. And again, the tax police was a way, and they did, and we had to deal with that, and, they could use that very aggressively. On the other hand, we did have some layer of protection, et cetera. On the other hand, being a foreigner, we were also more of a target in a specific way. And I'll highlight why, right? So, you understand that when we, right, in Ukraine, right, they don't say that the war started on February 22nd, right? We say the full-scale invasion started, and we know the war started in 2014. First started in 2014, Crimea and turned back. But we also know, and one blessing that we have, as I mentioned earlier, this question of Ukrainian history, how it wasn't studied, right? There used to be, in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion, there's a bunch of whole new books about Ukraine and Ukrainian history since 91, which have recently come out, which, are able, to give us a much deeper view of the Kuchma years, the Yushchenko years, right, from 91 up until 2014. And we know a lot more about it than, and again, I was very active on the journal, stuff I didn't know, was completely missed. And you're starting to piece back that, hey, yes, the invasion did start in 2014, but it didn't come out of the blue, right? And you piece back. Obviously, we understand what happened to Yushchenko in 2004, right? The Russians poisoned him, right? They poisoned the presidential candidate of Ukraine. We understand what happened in 2003 with Tulia Island, right, where the Russians were trying to take over Tulia Island and take control of the sea, right? Oh, and in hindsight, you understand this was a pattern. So the question that emerges is, when did this war for Ukrainian sovereignty, right? That's what I call it, right? It's not the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not the Ukrainian war. Ukraine didn't choose this war. It's not the Russia-Ukraine war, right? It's not two equal powers, right? You can call it the Russian invasion of Ukraine, maybe, or you could say it's the war for Ukrainian sovereignty. That's what the entirety of the battle is. It's not about NATO, where should Ukraine be a sovereign nation or not, and when did it start? When were the first seeds of it? And I highlight. Well, obviously, you can go back and say, this is 300 years ago, but in the modern era. So, in 2000, right, we know Putin was, came to power on December 31st, 1999, right? Yeltsin stepped down, and he was put in, right? In 2000, right, and up to that time, Kuchma was following this path of balancing between West and East, right? And we understand on the Budapest, he wanted Russian guarantees as well as American guarantees, and perhaps he played it. Right in 2000, he was pushing closer towards America, right? And trying to reach agreements to it. And we also, now it's come out that, there were a ton of Russian spies in his cabinet. And, the way to torpedo the Ukrainian overtures to America, right? They chose me, and they made me persona non grata.
Okay.
Right? So that happened in March 2000, right? So 3 months after Putin came into power. And right, it was 2 days, this happened 4 days before Albright, who was Secretary of State under Clinton, was supposed to arrive to meet with Kuchma to solidify a Ukraine-American treaty. Well, as I say, so on one hand, we had a level of protection. On the other hand, we were the highly symbolic view of, well, what's free press in Ukraine, and if you kick an American out of the country. And so we were persona non grata. I arrived into Ukraine. They said, sorry, we're not going to let you in. Spent the night under interrogation. And then they said, well, we're going to have to deport you. Perhaps, and they said, we're going to put you on the next plane to Moscow. I said, I'm not going to Moscow. And I convinced them to let me wait and get on the Austrian flight to Vienna. Flew to Vienna. And in that interim, what it did was it torpedoed the discussions between Albright and Kuchma. Albright said she's not going to arrive. She's going to cancel her trip unless I'm allowed back in. And there are two people in the country who can sign that persona non grata paper, which is the president, Kuchma, or the head of the SBU. The one thing we do know now is he and his son, on February 2022, they both ran away to Russia. Yeah. Right? So it's 100% clear he was a Moscow spy in one way or another. So he signed the paper, and i.e., to sabotage any overtures of Ukraine to the West. This is back in 2000.
Yeah.
So you start piecing what happened in 2000, right? That was a first volley. It may have been the first volley in this Ukrainian sovereignty, where they chose us and this and that. And then obviously what happened to Gangadze, which was a much worse and tragic thing, where they, took a journalist out and decapitated him, which then solidified and ostracized Kuchma from the West. Right? He was an untouchable in the West for the next couple of years. Right? Then with the hope that in 2004, they could put their man in, Yanukovych. You remember Putin back then was still playing nice towards Ukraine. He came, landed in Kyiv, and was campaigning for him in the idea that, it was an attraction. He was an added value. And you can still find YouTube clips of Putin that back then speaking about how Ukrainian and Russians, how they should be together, and Ukraine's a great language and Russian's a great language, and they should work together, right? He was trying to attract with the carrot as opposed to the stick, right? Obviously, we know what happened then, and then Ukrainians fought for freedom, and then we understand on the Yushchenko years, but that's all come out of how and when the battle is.
It seems to me like he believed his own propaganda that all these demonstrations and pro-West movements were somehow orchestrated by the United States and the West, rather than it being a grassroots thing that millions of people wanted. He didn't seem to connect those dots, in the way that he could assess what is actually happening in Ukraine. He almost he just believed there's these propaganda spin out
100%. I will, give credit that, hey, in their heart of hearts, I take them at face value. They don't believe Ukrainians are an independent nation. They don't believe that, that people could want to, right? And you've got to look at it. And again, that's why I call it the war for Ukrainian sovereignty. I believe it's a sovereign nation. I believe there is a Ukrainian nation. There is a Ukrainian language. And, this as an independent nation should make the choice of where they want to go and what their future should be. Do they want a dictatorship? Do they want to be aligned with Europe? Do they want to be aligned with Russia? Right? It's an independent nation, and they should make that choice. If you don't believe it's an independent nation, if you believe it's an artificial creation, well, then of course, they wouldn't choose that route, and it had to have been orchestrated from, right? They wouldn't want NATO. NATO had to be imposed on them, right? And again, that's what I use that phrase. It's a war for Ukrainian sovereignty. That's what I believe, and I'll take them at face value. They don't believe that, and that's why they're fighting this. I mean, obviously, they're wrong, but a lot of people fight for wrong ideas. I mean, we've seen that often. It doesn't make it better or less tragic. It's tragedy. And hey, that's where we are.
Since the full invasion started, find it hard to understand the logic. These are our brothers. We need to be brotherly nations. Instead of winning hearts and minds, I mean, he's killing all these Russian speakers, mostly in Eastern Ukraine, which has been hit a lot harder.
We tried hearts and mind, their belief is, hey, we tried hearts and mind in 2004, right? We campaigned for Yanukovych, but you know what? Underhanded, something, the CIA or underhanded, mysterious forces, infiltrated, and we now we have to battle that. I'll take them at face value. That they believe that. I think it's crazy, but I'll take it at face value that that's what they believe.
Yeah. Let's just jump back to the Kyiv Post. You ended up selling it, I guess, around 2009. How did that chapter end for you? And
by 2009, the Kyiv Post was less than 5%. It might have been about 2% of the total company in terms of revenue, right? The company. Again, we were the largest internet company in Ukraine. We had the largest news magazine, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I ended up selling everything in 2011 when Yanukovych came back in power. And as I say, there were a lot of difficulties under Kuchma. In terms of, right, after Yushchenko won election in 2004, now again, there were still economic problems, but the situation for free press turned night and day. Ukraine from 2004 on has had a very vibrant free press, and which is reaching very high standards. And then you see that across the board on civil society, freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and then what have you. Obviously in the Yanukovych years they tried to pull it back, but it wasn't possible. We built out, and the company quite large. We listed on the Ukrainian exchange in 2007. And then, sold the Kyiv Post off, and then sold the remainder of the company in 2011. Obviously, the Yanukovych years were very dark in Ukraine, and there was nothing. Right? He, was president, and those 2 years, they were stealing everything they could. And there was nothing inevitable about 2014 and Yanukovych, giving up power. And you look at Belarus, you look at Russia, they've cemented themselves in there for 20 years. And without a doubt, that was the hope and dream of Yanukovych. And it's a blessing that the revolution of dignity happened. And, obviously, there was violence there, but there was nothing inevitable about it. And if, and anybody who suggests there was inevitability about it is, I think they're misguided. It's, it's great that it happened, and we should be very thankful, and, thankful to the bravery of the Ukrainians who came out to the Maidan and took the steps needed and, fought for their freedom. But it was not an inevitability. And, when I sold in 2011, it definitely, anybody who claims that they predicted it, that was not the case in 2011.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems to me it's just part of the evolution of the society as far as like reclaiming their identity and reclaiming ownership from, you had Ukraine without Kuchma and I guess 2000, and then the Orange Revolution, and it gave people a belief that they could make changes or have some influence on things.
No doubt there's a progression, and civil society and steps came. It was not inevitable, and the wheel of history turns on very small things, and there was violence, and 100 people died. We don't fully know what limited that violence to that amount. And there were obviously individual Ukrainian heroes who stopped it, but there were Russians who were calling for more violence, etc. So it wasn't inevitable by any sense. It's a blessing, and we should be happy and thankful for those who stood up and fought for Ukraine on those days.
Yeah, for sure. I was there. I mean, I made a film. I filmed dead bodies in Hotel Ukraina being taken out. It was great. I mean, it was crazy. It's just these kind of things you see once in a lifetime, I guess.
Yeah. And so, after I sold the company, I was back in the States, and, once the full, and still deeply connected with Ukraine and, concerning family, but, didn't have any business there, active businesses. Once the full-scale invasion started, I spent a year or 2 years helping send medicine and drones in and helping people get out, doing U for U's for people to resettle in America. And, spent, 18 months on that until, in the spring of this year, when the supplemental bill was delayed, and it quickly became a realization, no matter how many drones, I might send, that's not going to win the war. And the most important battle as an American, as somebody sitting here, how I can help to win the war is to focus on political support for Ukraine in Washington, more so than any medicine I can send and this and that. So I set up the American Ukraine PAC. PAC stands for Political Action Committee, and just to give a quick outline on how U.S. political system works. Anybody's not familiar, right? There were, if you want to build political power in America, there were sort of two main avenues. One we would call advocacy, which means you're bringing voters and you're representing voters, right? And if you represent voters and you're speaking to your elected officials, you can go, you can demand, right? You can meet with them and say, I'm a voter and I want you to vote this way, etc. The other way is PAC work, political action committees, and you're bringing campaign donations and you're thanking, right? Political campaigns are run in America on donations from citizens. And, you're choosing, we choose key congressmen and we thank them. We say, wow, we see that you have stood up for Ukraine. You've supported Ukraine, and we want to thank you for that. One thing in America, and again, we have a federal system, so political power is dispersed and diverse within America. Obviously, you have a president, and we know the president, but the president only controls the executive. Within Congress, all legislation, all spending bills come out of Congress. You have two houses. And you can see that the key leaders of Congress come from across the country, right? The Speaker of the House is from Louisiana. The head of the Democrat Party in the House is from New York, half a mile from here, right? The head of the Senate now is from South Dakota, right? The head of appropriations is from Oklahoma, all over the country. So on advocacy, when you're doing voters, you can only speak to your local congressman. I'm here in New York. I can speak to my congressman on the Upper West Side. I can speak to my senator for New York. If I want to speak to Speaker of the House in Louisiana, he might say, listen, that's interesting. I don't represent you. He doesn't have any, right? When you do the PAC work and you're working with campaign donations, it allows you to have contact and conversations with politicians across the country and across the spectrum. And so, we've been focused on outreach and trying to build and solidify political support for Ukraine in Washington. The good news is, most Americans support Ukraine, you look at the last polls at 65%, believe that the U.S., they support the U.S. aid to Ukraine. They support the bills to support Ukraine. A majority of both parties, Republicans, Democrats do. And if you look in Congress, a majority of both parties in both houses support Ukraine, right? Dems and Republicans, right? And the votes have gone that way. So, we're not out there trying to change political opinion, right? To convince Americans, right? Americans already support Ukraine. It's really on the nuts and bolts of how to get legislation passed, where the votes are. And, democracy is sloppy and ugly, and how to get bills passed, it's slow. You're competing with a lot of different interests, right? And you can look at the supplemental, right? Which led to $61 billion of aid towards Ukraine. In the process of getting that passed, it got combined with aid to Israel and aid to Taiwan. That's not really connected. I mean, it's a little bit connected. Then you got to make sure that the supporters of Taiwan and Israel, et cetera, how they align with Ukraine. It also got connected a little bit to the border bill and, the U.S. border, which has nothing, obviously, to do to Ukraine, but in, political balancing, that's how it goes.
I was going to say, how have your efforts been received? I mean, there's certainly a strong faction that's pro-Ukraine, but there might be some that are maybe middle of the road, or some, there's obviously a percentage that are anti-Ukraine. So the ones that fall outside of we're strong Ukraine supporters. Have you engaged with any of those people, and how have they responded with you? And what has that conversation been like, or interaction?
So, and this obviously becomes, within the nuances of where you should put your efforts. You do have strong supporters of Ukraine. You have lukewarm supporters. And, I understand, look, if you're pushing a Ukraine bill in Chicago or New Jersey, where there's a lot of Ukrainians, that's a really easy vote for Ukraine. I got it. And for many Americans, the war in Ukraine, it's far away. Maybe, it's not top of mind. There are tougher votes. Now I believe helping Ukraine helps America, and most congressmen do see that, right? If we believe in strong American leadership, this is where we should be doing it. And there's if we believe in a strong American leadership, we need to put money and efforts behind it. But in some places it's difficult. And, listen, for the people that have tough votes, they appreciate the acknowledgement, so it's warmly received, to understand that, hey, we understand that it wasn't the easiest vote. Maybe, it was a politically risky vote, right? There was more than one congressman who voted in favor of Ukraine, and then they got a primary challenge from their own party, from somebody who was more isolationist, who said, wait a minute, hey, this guy, he's spending our tax money in Ukraine. Right? He didn't have to take that vote. Now, he can understand, even though, he believes it's the right thing, there's a political cost to it. Hey, you know what? When you're doing something costly, there's a political cost to it. Hey, being thanked is important. Being thanked, to being told, hey, that vote matters, not only in your district, but across the country. Hey, we understand you took a political risk, and we want to thank you for it. That's a very needed activity and something which Ukraine supporters should do, right? And I'm sure, I'm sure in Ukraine, hey, there's a lot of thanks for, the supplemental, for what the American people have given to support Ukraine. And we can argue maybe there could be more, maybe we want this and this, but grand scheme of things, hey, right? America said, wait a minute, Ukraine's our ally, and you know what? We're here to support them. Now, like I say, I believe it's also beneficial for Ukraine. There's a lot of knowledge. Okay, one, obviously, right? Ukraine's enemies are America's enemies, right? And we can see that, in Russia, or even going a step further in Iran and North Korea, right? Those are America's enemies. Obviously, within Ukraine right now, nobody in the world has more knowledge about drone technology than Ukraine. And it's very important that that knowledge is coming back, because we can see that America's enemies, are deeply involved in it. And, it's, Americans, getting knowledge from Ukraine is keeping America safe. Right?
I think so. I think there's a segment of Americans who don't perceive Russia as quite the enemy that they are, in the same way Russia has been perceives America and blames so much on America, and has been, at war in some way, in, one way or another,
Sure.
America. But a lot of these, guys who don't support Ukraine, like if you had to explain why is this in America's interest to people who are skeptical of like supporting Ukraine, because how is it in America's interest? And they don't necessarily see Russia as like a modern adversary for whatever reasons. I don't know why, but they don't. What do you, like, how do you break it down for those people?
Again, they were always, right? America's a big country. They were, and, there's always been an isolationist streak. We understand where people say, wait a minute, we don't want to get into a war. We don't want boots on the ground, right? And, to question, hey, right, what is the American interest? Now, America, has benefited, from the post-war stability. And the basic premise of European post-war stability is borders matter, right? That has been, and it has been a great thing for America and for Europe since 1945, right? That we accept borders in sovereign countries. You don't march over the borders of sovereign countries, right? We understand. And most Americans understand, hey, NATO has been a great stabilizing factor in Europe, and it's important. And I think Americans understand and do see the Russian threat, not only in, obviously, in Ukraine, but going further into Poland, into the Baltics. Now, there's, good faith arguments about, how much aid we should give. What type of weapons, right? Oh, we're right now the most recent one, and I myself, I'm very thankful to the Biden administration that they've changed their policy in giving Ukraine permission to defend itself as it sees best, wherever it sees best, right? And I think that's a long overdue policy. Some people might have a slightly more hesitant view. Go slower policy and to try and contain it. I disagree with it, but it's an acceptable discussion. There's very few Americans who believe Putin is a natural ally of America. Very few Americans who believe that the North Koreans are allies, and we need them on our side. You know, look, it's a tough question on how best to
Yeah.
contain, So
Following up on that, I'm sort of curious, like, there's always been this story within Ukraine, and I'm sure even that Ukraine has so much potential that if Ukraine can only, X, Y, Z, that it can become this breadbasket, this agriculture, this IT thing. The people are well educated, and I mean, you've spent time in Ukraine, Ukrainians. Like, is that part of the reason that you care so much? Like, do you feel like there is some sort of potential that hasn't been reached in that society, in that part of the world?
it's not that. I mean, I believe in Ukrainian potential, but this is purely, a you know family and friends, and there's a humanitarian and there's war crimes, right? I'm against massive war crimes. I'm against kidnapping and trafficking 20,000 children. Our American values, our Western values, stand with that. This is a very clear setup. Now, I am optimistic for the flourishing of Ukraine. Now, clearly, one thing that will allow Ukraine to flourish is if there isn't a neighbor who is actively trying to destroy the country, which it has been for the past 20 years. And again, poisoning presidential candidates. Obviously, the pipeline was a massive source of corruption within, right? The pipeline of natural gas from Russia through, and the 5 billion of laundered money that was going through that, which was meant to undermine Ukrainian institutions, right?
Yeah.
Like, when people speak of corruption, it wasn't homegrown Ukrainian corruption. I'm not saying that there was none of it, but it was imported in due to that pipeline, right? So much of it, and when you dig in, right, and you look, oh well, so much of the tragedy on Ukraine in the past 20 years was simply due to the Russians doing its best to cripple and undermine Ukrainian sovereignty. If there's an acceptance of Ukrainian sovereignty, this would be, Ukraine would be a richer and better country. But, the first thing that's needed is, for Ukraine to thrive is, to end the war with victory, to allow the country to rebuild. Nothing else is comparable.
Yeah, I would add maybe that, within Ukrainian society, there was a significant amount of pro-Russian agents or people working for the behalf of Russia. And that sentiment has largely gone away, I think, because of the war. These people who were neutral or
100%. I mean, and I'm sure you've seen, and this is beyond anecdotal, how many people who happily enjoyed speaking Russian, who chose and this and that, who at this point simply refused to.
yeah.
Right. And again, it's not surprising that people who grew up under the Soviet Union, who, were, there was, a very active policy of Russification. That, like, okay, that sounds like it, but, hey, those were the childhood books they grew up with. And, it's not surprising they've got some memory towards them and, what have you. And, at this point, they, there's adamant refusal. So, as I say, I believe, as Americans, focusing on building political support for Ukraine, it's the most important thing we can do. In the American Ukraine PAC, we work very actively with the advocacy organizations, the American Coalition for Ukraine, Razum Advocacy, UKK, right? They're all doing advocacy and they're focused on bringing voters. We're focused on the other side, the political action. The elections just happened. On the whole, I believe the elections were quite good for Ukraine, right? And as I mentioned, Congress had strong supporters in both parties. We do a congressional report card on our site. So if you go to amukrpac.org, there's a congressional report card. So there's information about the votes of every congressman on Ukraine. And, Congress became a little more on the margins pro-Ukrainian than it was. The key thing on this election, I would say it's the dog that didn't bite, because there were a ton of Ukraine champions. So you have people who vote in favor of Ukraine. Then you have the champions, people who are leading legislation on Ukraine. Marcy Kaptur in Ohio, Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania, Bacon in Nebraska. They had tough races. Some of it had nothing to do with Ukraine. That was just the nature of the system, right? Ohio has become a lot more Republican in the past couple of years. Kaptur's a Democrat. She's been a Ukraine champion, and it was a very tough race. She won by less than 1%. Bacon won by less than 1%. So a lot of the Ukraine champions were in very tight races. Right? We listed around 25 of them where it was decided by less than 2%. Hey, and they all won. We supported 25 candidates, 23 won.
Yeah.
And that we're very happy about. And we're happy we were there. We did a lot of, some was bringing money. Sometimes we organized campaign events for them. And so, there was a majority in Congress who supported Ukraine. That remains. Hey, that's good news for Ukraine, and that's good news for continued support from Washington to Ukraine. There's a new presidential administration, and for the non-Americans, right? There was not one election on election day. There were 500, right? There was a presidential. There was for every member of the House. There was for 1/3 of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. There's a new presidential administration. He's put together his foreign policy team. It's still early to, say precise. None of them have been approved yet, but you can look. And there is, strong support on Ukraine. Now, it's going to come to the details on that. But, you can really look at Congress and say, hey, right, this was a good election for Ukraine, and American support will remain there.
I hope so. And I think the work that you're doing, this niche that you found, how you can be effective, is really important. So I wish you the best with that work, and hopefully you'll get the support that you need to maintain that. And I mean, the legacy that you have left in Ukraine,
Thank you.
Kyiv Post still exists. Free journalism has always been, the strong part of society in Ukraine. I mean, you were a real pioneer. And I would love to have you read a book that you write about your life and experiences.
Thank you.
I think there's a lot there that, we didn't get to talk about today. And I know you got to go, but
thank you very much. We put out a ton of content from the PAC. So anybody who wants to get our newsletter, etc., come to our site, amukrpac, amukrpac.org, and sign up for our newsletter. And, just to stay informed, on the specifics of Ukraine policy in Washington, so we can follow it. And that, as Americans, I believe this is the most important thing we can do to support Ukraine and bring victory a little bit closer.
За свободу свою ставай до бою, за свою неземну ставай до бою, всі молитви тобі ставай до бою, брами неба озвуться громом.